They were free. But no one told them. For nearly 2 years after slavery had ended, 63 men, women, and children woke before sunrise, worked the fields, and obeyed every command. Because one man decided they would never hear the truth. No chains. No guards. Just a lie, so complete, it became their reality. The land remembers. Even when people try to forget, the land does not. Along the quiet, pine-shadowed lowlands of coastal Georgia, where the air hangs thick with salt and rot, and the earth itself seems to breathe, there once stood a plantation that did something almost impossible. It ignored the end of slavery. Not in rebellion. Not in chaos. But with intention. Precision. Silence. For nearly 2 years after the Civil War had ended, after the guns fell quiet, after the nation itself declared a new beginning, men, women, and children on this land continued to wake before dawn. Continued to bow their heads. Continued to work. Because as far as they knew, nothing had changed. No chains held them. No fences enclosed them. There were no armed patrols stalking the tree lines. And yet, they did not leave. Because the prison was not built of wood or iron. It was built of belief. When federal investigators finally arrived in the summer of 1866, they expected disorder, confusion, maybe resistance. What they found instead was something far more disturbing. Order. Routine. Obedience. A system still functioning, as if the war had never ended. One officer would later write, in a report that would quietly disappear into government archives for decades. This arrangement bears signs not of accident, but of design. Design. That was the word he chose. Not neglect. Not ignorance. Design. To understand how something like this could happen, you have to go back. Back before freedom had a chance to arrive. Back to a place where information moved slowly. And silence moved faster. The Georgia Low Country was never meant to be forgiving. By April, the heat settled in like a weight on the chest. By June, it became something else entirely. A presence. The marshlands stretched endlessly, breathing in tides that carried the scent of decay. Mosquitoes hovered like a constant whisper. The air clung to the skin. And in this suffocating landscape, life had always followed one rigid structure. White landowners at the top. Black labor at the bottom. No movement without permission. No speech without consequence. No knowledge, unless it was given. By the time the Civil War began collapsing in 1865, this entire system stood on the edge of extinction. But extinction requires acknowledgement. And acknowledgement requires truth. Derelict House, a county in ruin. McIntosh County had already been broken long before the war officially ended. Its towns burned. Its economy shattered. Its people, both enslaved and free, left drifting in uncertainty. The nearby town of Darien had been reduced to charred remains 2 years earlier. The war had passed through it like fire through dry grass. What remained was not recovery, but silence. And in silence, truth struggles to travel. Bust in silhouette, Cornelius Hartwell. At the center of this story was a man who did not panic when the world changed. He studied it. Cornelius Hartwell. 51 years old. A plantation owner not known for cruelty, but not known for mercy either. He was something more dangerous. He was careful. Methodical. The kind of man who read documents twice. Who kept records aligned down to the smallest detail. Who believed that control was not about force. It was about anticipation. When news of Confederate collapse began drifting through Georgia in fragments, whispers from passing riders, broken reports from distant cities, most men reacted with grief or rage. Cornelius Hartwell did something else. He calculated. Because he understood something that others did not. Freedom was not immediate. It was not a lightning strike. It was a message, and messages can be delayed. Brain the realization. On his plantation were 63 human beings. Not numbers. Lives. Generations born into a system where every piece of knowledge had been filtered, controlled, approved. They did not read newspapers. They did not travel freely. They did not verify information. Their understanding of the world came from one place: him. And in that realization, Hartwell saw something no one else dared to see. If freedom depended on information, then control the information, and you control reality. Scroll the lie begins. In May of 1865, just days after the Confederacy effectively collapsed, Hartwell gathered everyone together. The yard was dry. The heat unbearable. Dust clung to bare feet. They stood in silence, waiting. Because gatherings like this only happened for a reason. And reasons were never small. Hartwell stepped forward with a letter in his hand. It looked official. Stamped. Sealed. Authority wrapped in paper. But what he said next was a lie. He spoke calmly. Too calmly. No anger. No urgency. Just quiet certainty. He told them the war was not over. That the Union had failed. That President Lincoln had withdrawn his promises. That emancipation had been suspended. And then he gave them something even more powerful than a lie. He gave them fear wrapped in legality. He said leaving the plantation would be illegal. That anyone who tried would be captured and punished. That the law unchanged still stood against them. No one shouted. No one protested. Because how do you argue with information when you have no way to test it? The letter was never passed around. Never examined. It didn't need to be. Because the authority was not in the paper. It was in him. Muted speaker, the most dangerous silence. That night, something invisible settled over the plantation. Not relief. Not acceptance. Something quieter. Something heavier. Doubt. Some may have questioned it. Privately. In whispers between walls. But doubt without proof becomes silence. And silence becomes obedience. The next morning, they went back to work. What Hartwell created was something terrifying in its simplicity. No chains. No cages. Just a closed loop of information. Every authority figure nearby, sheriffs, magistrates, neighboring landowners, either supported the lie or chose not to disrupt it. Because acknowledging the truth would mean dismantling everything they had lost. And some systems fight to survive, even after they are dead. Open book testimony of August Grover. Months later, after the truth finally broke through, one man would try to explain what it felt like. He would choose his own name. August. After the month, he learned he was free. He said something investigators never forgot. He didn't look afraid of us. That was the detail. Not the lie. Not the letter. The calm. Because a man who lies fears being exposed. But a man who controls reality has nothing to fear at all. Candle something deeper. There is a kind of evil that shouts. That burns. That destroys in ways you can see. But there is another kind. Quieter. Colder. More patient. The kind that understands the human mind. That knows fear is stronger than chains. That belief can imprison more completely than iron ever could. And somewhere in the Georgia Lowcountry, under a sky that watched everything, that kind of evil took root, not through violence, but through silence. And for nearly 2 years, no one came to break it. Freedom was close. Closer than anyone on that land could imagine. It moved along dirt roads, through broken towns, In letters, in whispers, in footsteps. But every path that led toward it ran straight through a wall that no one could see. Fog, a world that refused to change. In the Georgia Low Country, the end of slavery did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like fog. Uneven. Patchy. Easy to deny. For a black man or woman in 1865, walking alone without proof of employment was not a step toward freedom. It was a risk. A visible danger. Because the world beyond the plantation had not yet decided what freedom meant. And until it did, anyone without explanation was suspect. Sheriffs did not need to be cruel. Merchants did not need to conspire. All they needed was hesitation. A question. Who do you belong to? And in that single question, freedom could collapse. Cornelius Hartwell understood this better than anyone. He didn't need to control the entire county. He only needed one thing: that no one would rush to correct his lie. Handshake the quiet reinforcement. In the weeks after his announcement, Hartwell wrote out. Not often. Not visibly. Just enough dust rising behind his horse as he visited neighboring plantations. As he stepped into quiet conversations in the remains of Darien. As he spoke in low tones with men who had lost everything and were not ready to accept it. No records remain of those conversations. No written agreements. No signatures. But outcomes leave traces. Because when workers from Hartwell's land, curious, cautious, uncertain, began to test the edges of the world, they found something chilling. Not confirmation. Not clarity. But something worse. Agreement. Or silence. A man passing on the road would nod and say, "Yes, that sounds right." A neighboring farm would offer half answers. Uncertain shrugs. Just enough to keep doubt alive. But never enough to spark action. This was not coordination. It was instinct. A system so deeply ingrained, it no longer required instruction. Truth did not need to be destroyed. It only needed to be delayed. Classical building, the promise of help. That never arrived. Far away, in theory, there was help. An institution created to guide the newly freed into a new life. The Freedmen's Bureau. On paper, it was powerful. It could enforce contracts, provide resources, intervene in abuses. But paper does not travel easily through swamps and broken roads. And in rural Georgia, the Bureau was stretched thin. Too few agents. Too much land. Too many stories. Each man carried dozens of cases. Each rumor had to be weighed. Each journey took time. And Hartwell Plantation was just another quiet place on a very long list. Repeat button, the machinery of routine. So life continued. As if history had paused. The bell rang before sunrise. Feet moved across familiar paths. Cotton rows stretched endlessly beneath the sun. Children laughed in the dust. Not because they were free, but because they did not yet understand what freedom was. Meals were cooked. Stories were told. Songs were hummed softly in the evening heat. The system did not need enforcement anymore. It ran on memory. On habit. On the deep, inherited belief that the world outside was more dangerous than the one they knew. But inside the cabins, something had begun to change. Her name was Deline. And she had lived long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. She had been born on that land. Her mother had died on it. She had spent a lifetime learning how to listen without being seen. Because survival had taught her a truth most never understood. When you are invisible, you hear everything. Deline could not read. But she didn't need to. She read people. Patterns. Interruptions. Silence. And something about Hartwell's story did not sit right. Not immediately. Not loudly. But slowly. Like a splinter beneath the skin. The first suspicion. It wasn't what Hartwell said. It was what happened after. Cecilia Hartwell, his wife, had always lived by routine. Visitors on certain days. Letters sent and received like clockwork. A rhythm as predictable as sunrise. But then, it stopped. No visitors. No gatherings. Fewer letters. Doors that stayed closed longer than before. The house had grown quiet. Too quiet. Deline noticed. Because noticing was how she had survived. People who have nothing learn to pay attention to everything. And what she saw was not normal. It was careful. Controlled. Hidden. The behavior of people. Protecting something. New moon, the birth of doubt. Deline didn't know the truth yet. But she knew this. If the war had truly continued, why hide? Why shrink your world? Why close your doors? Secrets only exist when there is something to conceal. And so, she began to listen differently. Not just to words, but to pauses, to glances, to what was not being said. Spiderweb the network. Over time, quietly, carefully, Deline began to speak to others. Not openly. Never openly. In fragments. In questions. In shared observations. 9 people. That was all. Men and women she trusted. People who understood the weight of silence. Among them was Solomon Price, young, watchful. And Reuben Tanner, a carpenter, older, steady. A man who moved between worlds. Because Tanner sometimes left. The door to the outside. Hartwell trusted Tanner. Trusted him enough to send him into town. It was a calculated risk. One Hartwell believed he controlled, but control is never absolute. In March of 1866, Tanner was sent to Darien. A simple task. Supplies. Nothing more. But in Darien, there was something Hartwell had not accounted for. A man named Marcus. Hammer and wrench Marcus, a different reality. Marcus was free. Truly free. He owned his name. His labor. His time. He worked in a small repair shop on the edge of the burned district, where the scars of war still marked the ground. When Tanner stepped into that doorway, something shifted. Because Marcus saw it immediately. The hesitation. The posture. The way Tanner carried himself. Like a man still bound. In a world that had already moved on. Later, Marcus would describe it simply. He looked like he came from yesterday. High voltage, the moment before everything changes. Tanner didn't come for answers. Not at first. But sometimes. Truth does not wait to be asked. Sometimes. It recognizes you. And in that small shop. In a broken town. In the quiet aftermath of a war that had already ended. 2 realities stood face to face. One free. One still imprisoned by a lie. And for the first time, the wall began to crack. Truth does not always feel like salvation. Sometimes, it feels like danger. When Reuben Tanner walked back from Darien that day, the world was no longer the same. But nothing around him had changed. The same road stretched ahead. The same trees leaned in silence. The same dust rose beneath his feet. And yet, every step felt uncertain. Because now, he knew something. Something that could set 63 people free. Or destroy them all. Balance scale, the weight of knowing. Marcus had not spoken softly. He didn't have time for softness. The war is over, he said. Lincoln is dead. You're free. 3 sentences. Simple. Final. But truth is not always accepted just because it is spoken. As Tanner walked, those words turned inside him. Over and over. Testing themselves against everything he had lived for the past year. If this was true, then everything Hartwell had said was a lie. If this was false, then repeating it could be fatal. Because what if this was a test? What if Hartwell had set it up? A trap. To find out who questioned him. Who doubted. Who hoped. Hope. That was the most dangerous part. Because hope changes behavior. And behavior can be seen for 4 days. Tanner said nothing. He worked. Ate. Slept. Moved through the rhythms of the plantation exactly as before. But inside, something was unraveling. He began to notice things he had missed. Or perhaps, things he had chosen not to see. No soldiers. Not once, in over a year. No signs of war. No movement of armies. No urgency. And then, something sharper. He remembered a federal agent, months earlier. At a neighboring property. The man had not been attacked. Had not been turned away. Had not been hunted down by Confederate forces. As Hartwell had insisted would happen. The memory sat there. Heavy. Undeniable. And slowly, fear began to change shape. It was no longer fear of punishment. It became fear of truth. Because if the truth was real, then everything they had endured since the war ended, every sunrise in the fields, every command obeyed, every day lived in ignorance, had been stolen. And that kind of theft is harder to face than chains. Fire the moment of trust. On the 5th day, Tanner went to Deline. He spoke quietly. Carefully. Like a man stepping across thin ice. He told her everything. Every word Marcus had said. Every doubt he had carried. Every fear he still held. Deline did not interrupt. She did not react. She listened. The way she had always listened. Completely. When he finished, there was silence. Long. Heavy. Then she said, I knew he was lying. A pause. I just didn't know the truth. Another pause. Now we do. And in that moment, something changed. Not in the fields. Not in the house. Not in the eyes of Hartwell. But underneath it all. In the unseen place where belief lives. The lie was no longer complete. Candle a dangerous decision. Freedom was now within reach. But reaching for it could destroy them. Deline understood something Tanner did not. Leaving all at once was not freedom. It was exposure. 63 people walking the road together. Would be seen. Stopped. Questioned. Returned. Because the world outside was still controlled by the same hands. They needed something else. Not escape. Proof. They needed the truth to arrive. From outside. Through authority Hartwell could not deny. They needed the law. To speak. Spiderweb turning the lie back on itself. So they did something extraordinary. They stayed. They worked. They obeyed. They performed the lie. Perfectly. But underneath, they built something else. A quiet understanding. Shared carefully. Spread slowly. Not everyone at once. Never all at once. Truth, like fire. had to be controlled. Too fast, and it would consume them. Too slow, and it would die. And so, over weeks, every adult on the plantation came to know. Not loudly, not openly, but with certainty. They were free. And still, they worked, warning the breaking point approaches. By late spring of 1866, the balance had become fragile. The lie still stood, but barely. And then, two things began moving toward each other. From outside, a man who had started to ask questions. From inside, a man who could no longer stay silent. Fallen leaf, the weak link. His name was Apprentice Hartwell. Young, broken, haunted. War had taken something from him. Something no one could repair. His hand was shattered. But it was not the worst injury. The worst was inside. The kind that drinks cannot quiet. The kind that grows louder in silence. 4 months. He had lived inside his father's lie. Watched it. Carried it. Protected it. But he did not have his father's discipline. And truth has a way of leaking through the weakest places. Tumbler glass the night everything slipped. One night. Drunk, restless, angry. Apprentice walked toward the cabins. He wasn't thinking clearly. He wasn't planning anything. He just wanted someone to hear him. To understand. Because the world he had fought for was gone. And no one in his house would say it out loud. So he went where silence had always lived. The cabins. 2 men were outside, watching the night. Apprentice spoke, not clearly, not directly. But the truth was there, hidden inside his anger. You don't even know what you are. He laughed. Bitter. Broken. You don't even know. The men said nothing. No reaction. No questions. No change in expression. They had practiced this. 4 weeks. They gave him exactly what he expected. Nothing. And when he staggered away, the night held its breath. Because everyone knew. Something had just shifted. Sunrise, the morning of reckoning. Before dawn, the message reached DeLine. And by sunrise, everything was ready. Because on that same morning, another man arrived. Not from the fields. Not from the house. But from the outside world. Balance scale James Pruitt. He came with authority. With purpose. With questions. And this time, he came without warning. No sheriff. No interference. No delay. Just the truth. Walking onto the land. Derelict house, the final performance. Cornelius Hartwell met him at the road. Calm. Composed. Controlled. He smiled. Welcomed him. Offered water. Presented documents. Contracts. Signed with marks. Proof of agreement. He spoke like a man who had done nothing wrong. Because until that moment, his system had worked perfectly. But then, Pruitt said something simple. I'd like to speak with them. Alone. And just like that, the entire structure began to collapse. Because the lie had always depended on one thing: control of the conversation. And now, that control was gone. Magnifying glass tilted, left, the truth emerges. One by one, the workers spoke. At first, carefully. Then clearly. Different voices. Same story. No coordination. No script. Just truth. Finally allowed to exist. By midday, it was undeniable. The war had ended. Freedom had come. And it had been hidden when Deline sat before Pruitt. She did not hesitate. She spoke with precision. With clarity. With the quiet strength of someone who had waited long enough. She described everything. The announcement. The silence. The changes in the house. The lie. And as she spoke, the weight of it settled into the record. Not rumor. Not suspicion. Truth. The truth had arrived. But truth does not erase what has already been taken. It was late afternoon when Deline finished speaking. The air was heavy. Still. Even the wind seemed to pause. As if the land itself was listening. James Pruitt sat across from her, pen unmoving for a moment. Because what she had just given him was not just testimony. It was structure. A lie, carefully built. And a truth, even more carefully revealed. Candle, we needed a witness. He asked her a question that, on paper, seemed simple. If you knew, why didn't you leave? Deline didn't answer immediately. Because the question carried something deeper. Something people who had always been free often failed to understand. Then she said, "We needed a witness." Her voice was steady. Certain. Leaving puts us back out there, where nobody sees us. A pause. Staying lets you see it all at once. And then. The line that would live in the report forever. He built it careful. We had to take it apart the same way. Balance scale the accounting of theft. That night, Pruitt wrote. Not casually. Not briefly. But with urgency. Precision. Weight. Page after page. Names. 63 lives. Each one recorded. Hours worked. Fields harvested. Days stolen. He calculated everything. Not just labor. But time. 22 months. 22 months of sunrises that should have meant freedom. But didn't. 22 months of belief. Controlled. When he finished, the number sat on the page like a wound. Wages owed a sum large enough to matter. Large enough to prove something had been taken. But numbers do not guarantee justice. Classical building the illusion of consequence. Cornelius Hartwell was informed that evening. The lie was over. The system dismantled. The truth official. And still. He stood in his doorway. Calm. Because men like him understand something most do not. Truth is not the same as consequence. He spoke of law. Of process. Of resolution. As if this were a misunderstanding. But this was not confusion. This was design. And design demands accountability. Except. Not always. Balance scale a system that hesitated. The case moved forward. Slowly. Carefully. Documents filed. Reports reviewed. Testimonies recorded. Everything was clear. The lie. The manipulation. The theft of labor. The coordination, spoken or unspoken, of a system that allowed it. And yet, justice hesitated. Because the law, in that moment in history, was uncertain. The country had ended slavery. But it had not yet decided how far it was willing to go to enforce freedom. Cornelius Hartwell was not imprisoned. He was fined. A number far smaller than what had been stolen. A number that could be absorbed. Reduced. Delayed. A penalty. But not a reckoning. The sheriff who had helped sustain the lie. Removed. Then quietly returned, years later. Others. Censured. Recorded. Forgotten. Because records do not enforce themselves. And memory fades where power remains. Open file folder buried truth. Pruitt's report was filed. Stamped. Stored. A document of truth. Of clarity. Of evidence. And then silence. Years passed. Then decades. The system that had allowed the lie moved on without answering for it. Until one day, long after the voices that lived it had faded, someone found the file again. A historian reading through forgotten records. And suddenly, the past spoke. Not loudly, but clearly of the people of Hartwell Plantation. Left. Not together. Not ceremoniously. But in quiet departures. Some to nearby towns. Some to distant cities. Some northward. Carrying with them something no record could fully capture. Not just what had been done to them, but what had been taken from them. Time. Candle Deline's final years. Deline went to Savannah. She never learned to read. But she never needed to. Because she understood something deeper. Truth is not only written, it is observed, felt, recognized. Those who knew her later said she had a presence, a way of listening that made people uncomfortable. Because she could tell when something wasn't true. And once you've lived inside a lie that long, you never forget how to recognize one. Hammeran wrenched the others. Tanner stayed close. Worked with his hands again. Built things that were real. Marcus, the man who spoke the truth first, remained where he was. A quiet link between two worlds. Solomon, the youngest, traveled farther. Carried the story in pieces. Fragments. Lessons. And years later, someone would remember something he said. The worst thing you can do to a person is not hurt them. A pause. It's decide what they're allowed to believe. New Moon, the man who built the lie. Cornelius Hartwell died years later. Quietly. His illness. Real after all. But whatever he believed, whatever justification he carried, was buried with him. Because history does not always record intent. Only impact. The fields are still there. The river still floods. The heat still settles in by spring. Nothing in the soil tells you what happened. But something lingers. Because places remember. Even when people do not. Warning, final reflection. This was not magic. Not mystery. Not something beyond understanding. It was human. A man looked at a group of people and realized if you control what they know, you control what they do. No chains required. Just silence. Just delay. Just enough distance between truth and those who need it. And for nearly 2 years, that was enough. Candle closing. So the question is not just what happened here. The question is, how many times has it happened? Without being recorded? How many lives have been shaped? Not by force, but by the quiet control of truth? Because the most effective prisons are the ones you don't know you're inside.